So the principal mechanism for this bargain of identity for service today is the TOS agreement, the Terms of Service Agreement. That's the governing law or policy by which the consumer interacts with a website or an e-commerce service. And the TOS agreement, say what you will about it, Andy said it was impenetrable and opaque, which I think is a fair characterization. But suppose for a moment you could put all the TOS agreements alongside of each other. And suppose for a moment you could expose all those TOS agreements in one place for the scrutiny of the marketplace. Clearly, almost 98% of the room would not bother with that. But there are 2% of the people in the room, the folks that are privacy conscious or in the business of advocating or researching privacy, that they would find that a helpful thing, to be able to do a read across of TOS agreements, and that on behalf of the consumer, they could offer an opinion. They could begin to rate how data is used, or how privacy is protected, or how information is secured in each of those TOS agreements. Suppose we were to have a platform where the trust frameworks that Kim Cameron talked about earlier and that were alluded to in different places could also be registered alongside of each other. What that would do for the first time is to allow the general public, if it so choose, but the advocates and agents of the general public, to begin to make an informed decision about the privacy protections or the security or the service levels of each of those trust frameworks, each of those schemes. What OIX is doing now is to build a platform, a registry, so that all of those trust frameworks or scheme rules or TOS agreements or certifications can be found in one place and enable the consumer or the agent of the consumer, the advocate for an issue, to begin for the first time to do an intelligent read across of the now opaque, now diffuse TOS agreements that are really at the cornerstone of this identity and service economy stuff. So what OIX is doing on a global basis is creating that registry, a global registry for trust frameworks, for TOS agreements, for certification, so you can put in one place a mechanism for people to investigate the terms and conditions, the technology and the policies that are inherent in a given given trust framework or a given TOS agreement or a given set of scheme rules. The benefit of that, again, would be trust. We've talked a lot about trust today. It keeps coming up again and again and again. And by this time, you may be like me, just so numb to it that you're not quite sure what trust means. But trust turns out to be the engine of an economy, certainly the engine of an online service. Trust will be the thing that makes or breaks Verify. See, I just got Janet to look up. Someone asked Jack Ma, who's the founder and CEO of Alibaba, what's the most important thing to you? He said, trust. He said, the minute the stakeholders within Alibaba distrust the system falls apart. A year ago, I was in Ireland, and I was on a panel with the founder and CEO of Nest, you know, the device that sits in your home. And it was a week after Google bought it. Made the guy a billionaire overnight. And the question was asked, well, how has your life changed? He said, Google has just bought you. You've hit the jackpot. And he said, well, a funny thing happened. He said, the day after the public announcement of Google's acquisition of Nest, CEOs of all of my partners began to call me. And they said, in effect, we don't trust you anymore. He said, why don't you trust me? I'm the same company I was today that I was yesterday. I said, no, you're owned by Google. We don't know what's going to happen with the data about our refrigerator that we make that your Nest device is now going to announce. So this notion of trust is not just a abstract, it is the fundamental driver of online commerce. And the notion of trusted transactions, building trust in online transaction, is the unifier across OIX. So if you're a member of OIX, or if you're on the board of OIX, whether you're Cabinet Office or Google, PayPal or Experian, the thing that you have in common is your interest in trust, because trust is the engine for transactions, and transactions are what we're all about. Whether you're Verify, Janet put up her metrics. To her great credit, she's engaging you in trust, because she's saying that at any time, anyone from anywhere, at no cost, can look and see how the Verify program is doing. What a remarkable thing.
So what else, Don, can people be doing, particularly in this room, to help engender trust in their own projects and programs? That's obviously one of the key themes that's come out today that we've heard time and time again. What's our challenge to our members and the board here today?
So I think the challenge is how do we build a UK digital economy that's built on trust? How can the UK differentiate itself on a global basis? Because as I look out at the skyline, I'm looking over at Canary Wharf and I'm going, wow, financial services are one of the engines of the UK economy, without a doubt. The UK economy is a function of two things: a UK market that interoperates with a global ecosystem. And today, if we want to make the kind of advances in the UK economy, the new economy of data, some would say identity data, we have to take the same construct. We have to say, how can the UK market prosper, but also interoperate with a global ecosystem? That challenges the UK in a particularly important way at a particularly important time, which is now. You've heard about the changing models for trust, for interoperability, for legislation and regulation in Europe. You've heard about, and you know quite well, that in the west coast of the US, in Silicon Valley, it's really anything goes. Two polar notions in the marketplace. It is the UK that uniquely can find a way of creating a framework where identity data can be transacted at a high volume, a high velocity, and a high variety of applications in a trusted way.
Don, I know I have a few questions for you and a few points I want to raise about today, but we do have a question from the floor. I don't know if Sue is able to get to a gentleman here.
Don't ask for questions yet. There's a bunch of people waiting.
No, he was particularly waving just on your point here, and I was encouraging questions earlier.
So before John, as you make your way to John, I'll finish my thoughts. So
please do.
I think it is incumbent upon folks in this room, leaders in this new emerging space, to begin to think about what are the trust mechanisms? How do we instrument trust in the UK so that we can create this marketplace, realize the potential of what Jamie talked about this morning, but be part of a global ecosystem so that goods and services, online services, not only can be consumed in the UK, but can be consumed on a worldwide basis. That's the challenge before you. And that's the opportunity that I think the UK uniquely has at this time. At this time, because you have programs like Verify and changes like the ones noted with the TISA folks, and you have, as Andreas put out very well, the forming regulatory environment in the EU and the inescapable power, global juggernaut that's represented in Silicon Valley. Where is it, how is it that the UK marketplace can survive in those different models at this time? John.
Yeah, John Bullard from Identrust. Don, I'd just like, because I think what you were talking about trust is very true. We've heard a lot of the use of the word trust. We've heard very little of the use of the word liability. What happens when it goes wrong? As it surely will. Where does the buck stop? Is there a dispute resolution process? All that sort of stuff. You then put that in the context of the very clear analogy you make as to what's happening in Silicon Valley and the speed and the power and the amount of capital and so on there, and you look at the efforts in this little island nation to do what we're trying to do domestically here. And I think this issue of liability, and frankly, how many lawyers are there in this room? There are lots of technology folk, but I haven't seen many of the leading law firms represented here. And I think that's a big issue that's still unaddressed.
Yet I think liability is one of the fundamental precepts of a trust framework. So when Kim was talking about trust frameworks as being fundamental to Microsoft, it stands to reason, because a trust framework is simply a multi-party contract where everybody is agreeing to the same terms and conditions. So there are three different ways that one can create trust extant online. One is bilateral agreements. My lawyers will meet with your lawyers and we're going to negotiate a contract. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it doesn't scale. Another way of doing it is loosely coupled SLAs. This is the foundation of Facebook and other social. If your website keeps doing that, I'm going to keep doing this. So the power of Facebook's adoption worldwide is that everybody that uses Facebook Connect agrees to the same terms and conditions. It's really powerful because Facebook has bots that go through, and if you're in violation of those terms and conditions, guess what? You're turned off. So we have bilateral contracts, we have loosely coupled SLAs, and we have this thing in the middle called trust frameworks. All trust frameworks is the sum of two parts: technology standards and legal agreements. The sum of those two parts for multi-party agreements is a trust framework or a set of scheme rules. In a scheme rule, properly done, a trust framework properly done, just like in a contract properly done, assigns liability to each participant in the service. So that before someone enters into the trust framework, they have an opportunity to see exactly how liability is to be managed and exactly what the consequences are of behavior that contravenes those agreements and what the dispute resolution mechanism might be. So trust frameworks are really hard, but they turn out to be really useful. They're really useful because they allow lots of stakeholders to interact with each other with the terms and conditions and the technology standards pre-negotiated. The liability is as clear as the technical standards in a given communities of interest trust framework. So it could be that one of the ways that the Verify program creates the marketplace that Janet began today's discussion with is to create a trust framework that represents a public and private partnership that lays out the terms and the conditions, the technical tools, and the legal rules. The legal rules including, and importantly, things like liability and redress, and the technical standards that importantly inform interoperability between and among all the participants. So the trust framework is the mechanism of choice for internet scale deployments and for the development of the kind of marketplace that Janet talked about and Kim Cameron talked about. Because you want to have a marketplace that serves the immediate interests, in this case of the UK, but also interoperates with a global ecosystem. So the trust framework notion, a multi-party contract, then is registered. So if we register the trust framework, let's assume we had a trust framework that addressed, let's take an example, how services developed for Verify might be used in other applications in Her Majesty's government or other applications in the commercial sector. Suppose we had that sorted out. What we would want to do is to make sure everyone trusts that agreement. How would we do that? We would do with that agreement the same thing that Janet did this morning, which would be to post, to register, if you will, the terms and conditions of the trust framework. We would want to make sure that it's trusted. To make sure that it's trusted, we would do so by enabling anyone, at any time, from anywhere, at no cost, to see everything. That's my formulation of trust. That anyone, at any time, for no cost, from anywhere, can see everything in the contract, in the trust framework. So that's what I mean by trust. That's what, for those of you like me that have been married a long time, I open my mouth and my wife will tell me what I said. She'll respond to it. And every once in a while I'll say, well, how did you know I was going to say that? She says, well, I've been married to you for 25 years. I know what you're going to say. And she's right. Because trust in this is the reliability and repeatability of experience. That's what trust is in this definition. We want lots of experiences to be repeated at a very high volume, at a high velocity. That's the growth engine of Facebook and Google and PayPal. Volume, transactions, trusted, trusted, trusted. So the OIX registry, which we're just beginning to expose now, does a very simple thing. It makes no judgment whatsoever about the trust framework, but it allows that trust framework, that set of scheme rules, that TOS agreement, to be exposed for the scrutiny, as Kim said, of the crowd. Anyone at any time can look at it. That's how you build trust in online services. You build a trust framework, and then you take the extra step of saying, here it is. The other thing that's handy about that is that you get the same adoption dynamic going that Facebook had with its view. Because anyone can see everything at any time at no cost. It means that communities of interest, companies, countries, organizations can join you because they already see the contracts. They don't have to negotiate it with you. So one can imagine a year from now when we get together for Economics of Identity 3, it could be that as a result of a public-private partnership, a private sector-led public-private partnership, that a set of rules, a trust framework, could be adopted, could be registered. And it could say, hey, if you're going to use anything that has to do with Verify, it better follow these conditions. So the question is, how do you enforce that kind of thing? we can't call the blue helmets in from the United Nations, but we do have something even more powerful, which is that once you expose a trust framework to the crowd, all the companies and organizations that are a part of that framework take on the responsibility of enforcing it. So if a bad actor joins the framework, the people with the biggest incentive to identify the bad actor, require that bad actor to change immediately, are the people within the framework. So you have a self-enforcement, self-policing mechanism that's engendered by having the framework registered and so exposed.
We've heard a lot about trust today.
And you just started then to touch on rules previously called out, before this conference and around it, I tend to rules of the road.
Mm-hmm.
And in our discussions in shaping this conference, you very clearly said that you have some ideas about how that can be engendered, but actually it's really, the compelling thing is for all of the OIX members to be able to get involved. So how can we perhaps kind of engender that debate? How do people get involved in rules of the road?
So if rules of the road can be seen as scheme rules,
Yep.
I think we all agree that the current state, Baroness Martha Lane Fox says we need rules of the road for the internet. We especially need rules of the road for identity services in the UK. If you don't create those rules soon, you won't have the opportunity of an international market.
So how do you imagine people would create the rules? We
Talked about earlier about, obviously underpinning in collaboration, that markets will evolve, people will try, be exposed, learn from things and collaborate from them.
The rules have to be, in my view, personal opinion,
I'm asking your views.
have to be private sector led. It is unrealistic to ask the government to lead a conversation around how a marketplace should be regulated or self-regulated. I think it's impractical. What the Verify people are doing, what Janet spoke to, is that they're going to create a very successful Verify program. The results of the Verify program could be a very satisfying procurement, or it could be the catalyst for the development of a set of rules that will govern the UK marketplace that we've talked about.
Yep.
So we have a starting point with Verify, but we need private sector leadership to carry the conversation on about a trust framework or a set of rules that will govern the development of this emerging marketplace, that will accelerate it. So it's my view that that has to be a private sector-led public-private partnership, because the government has to be at the table, because the government has the very legitimate interest of protecting the privacy and security of its citizens.
Sure, so what could
People do. What could people do? How could they get involved?
Well, a whole bunch of people in this room have done what I would first suggest, which is join OIX. It's self-serving, but I think it's a bit more. I think it's to create an instance of OIX that will look after and be concerned about the acceleration of the digital services marketplace here in the UK and in Europe. I think that if you could create a OIX Europe or an OIX UK, you'd have the starting point for that leadership point of view. The leadership of who will create, who will draft this set of scheme rules that will govern how the UK marketplace is to be accelerated, but also, and importantly, how it interoperates with the global ecosystem.
Okay, thank you.
you. And is there anything today that you heard that particularly surprised? We talked a lot about trust, and it was very clear in terms of building that trust framework, which led us on to the rules of the road conversation. Is there anything you heard today that surprised you, or anything you heard today that you'd just like to speak to and remind people of?
When Mike Pegman talked about his proposition that the data's already out there, let's say, for instance, he was right. That means that if you assume that all the data is already out there, that means that most of the companies here in the UK are working at a disadvantage and will likely fail. Why is that? Because if the data is already out there, the race will go to the ones with the most money and the most engineers. And with a few exceptions, those are not UK companies. For the most part, they're either Chinese or they're somewhere along the Route 1 corridor in Silicon Valley. They have the kind of billions of dollars of cash at their availability, and to have the tens of thousands of engineers that they're scraping from the entire globe. It's a very tough competition. But the UK has an opportunity to create a new way where privacy can be protected, security can be guaranteed, and yet transactions and markets can develop at a high rate.
And
How can people get involved in that?
Well, 3 companies on the OIX board have said, look, this is all well and good, this global thing called Open Identity Exchange, but we want to begin to build standards, best practices, and a set of trust frameworks for the UK. Because we know that the UK has to interoperate with EIDAS, and we know that the UK has to be successful in building its own industry. So Barclays, Experian, and Timson have petitioned the OIX board to create a organization affiliated with OIX that looks specifically at the UK and EU marketplace. And those 3 companies, I think for all kinds of purely commercial reasons, are saying that we need a marketplace that isn't anything goes, that has to interoperate with the EIDAS. We need to start building a framework, a set of rules, together with Her Majesty's government that will speak to how we accelerate this economy. So to their credit, the OIX members, Timson, Experian, and Barclays have said, we're willing to be the first among the leaders of a private sector-led public-private partnership that will do one thing. It will begin to have the courage of the first draft about what a trust framework might be that will articulate the rules and tools of a set of scheme rules, that will talk about standards, that will talk about policies, liability, et cetera, bespoke for the UK marketplace.
so it's great.
It's that they've had the opportunity to understand what's missing, understand what they might try, come to the board and make that proposition, and really kind of encouraging other members to seize up on that opportunity to look at what else has been trialled and tested or find their own path in that, certainly.
I think it's, I was doing a little bit of research, and a fellow named John Lloyd in 1680 here in London created a thing which he called the Circle of Trust. It's in 1680. What's that?
I think it was the Fockers.
Very popular movie too.
So the Circle of Trust back then for John Lloyd was that they would set a set of underwriting rules for insurance. These were for captains and financiers of the maritime trade, of which the UK dominated, much in the same way that Facebook dominates the world today. But John Lloyd said, okay, everybody that agrees to this set of rules, sign here. This is where the term underwriter came from. So you write your name underneath that of the guy before you, saying that I agree to this set of rules. Then what John Lloyd, of what became Lloyd's Bank, did was to publicly expose the registry of underwriters so that any other underwriters that wanted to follow John Lloyd's rules could do that. I suspect that in 2016, companies like Timpson, Barclays, and Experian will be like John Lloyd saying, here's a set of rules that we'd like to create. Help us create these rules, and anybody else that wants to underwrite those rules can do so. Perhaps, and importantly, Cabinet Office, Her Majesty's government would say, okay, we've had a hand in discussing those rules, which is not an easy task, but we too will see these standards as important to us. We'll underwrite that set of scheme rules that will be a authoritative reference for how privacy is to be protected, how security is to be guaranteed, and how commerce can happen in the UK.
Thank you.
Are you happy for me to open up to the floor before we go
Yes,
into kind of
okay.
closing remarks? There's a gentleman just there, so very near you, in fact. A short Joe today. Thank you very much.
Talked about the OIX members, you've talked about the B2B, and I'm just not clear in my mind. We still need to get the consumers to sign up to verify. And if you read what's in the press, the trust that the consumer has for the commercial world or even government is a significant barrier to that. All of the consumers who would be on Verify and probably used in the other corporate sectors, insurance, banking, etc., probably interact with government in health, HMRC, DWP at some stage. I mean, I'm thinking the only way you can get them involved in Verify is to mandate the process. And I'm raising this because, and then you build trust from that. So my wife had to say, I'm going to marry him and take a risk. And it's been 25 years like you, and she's just about saying, I trust this guy. Yeah, so I'm just saying, how do you get those consumers on board with this process and then build trust? Because trust doesn't necessarily come from day one. It's driven by demand.
When I mandate my wife to do something, it does not turn out well. I think both the opportunity and the challenge of Verify is that it really requires a marketplace to develop around it. That if Verify is a single-threaded effort, the economies of scale, the competition that Janet deliberately wants to trigger won't occur.
She is nodding. I can see her.
So Verify needs a UK identity services market to emerge, and I would say the emergence of a UK identity services market would be greatly benefited by a successful Verify program. What Verify will do for the first time is alert and educate the British populace to identity and verification. Wouldn't that be a particularly useful moment for, let's pick out 3 companies. Barclays, Experian, and Timpson's. Wouldn't they be the principal beneficiary about a populace that began to say, you know, I want to take my identity services more seriously than I have before. I want to begin to trust the agent that is going to be working for me or being my intermediary with Her Majesty's government. So I think you can create a market dynamic around trust that gets catalyzed by Verify but gets monetized by commercial providers of identity services in the UK. What won't work is that if nothing happens in 2016 in the UK, the status quo will prevail. And the status quo is that the monetization of personally identifying information is creating enormous wealth for a few companies based, for the most part, in a beautiful place called Northern California. If nothing occurs, if no schemes or trust frameworks are developed, Verify will slug it out in a very difficult adoption effort. because we've seen that the consumers are slow to pick up on the importance of privacy and security. But if the messaging were to be coordinated and complementary between the leaders of the UK identity services market, the IDPs on the verified contract, and Her Majesty's government, then you've got a good shot at creating this new market dynamic that I've spoken to.
We've probably got time for about one more question, I think, and then we need to wrap up. This gentleman just there.
That's great. We won't have to hear from this lot here in the second row here.
They have said quite a lot today. So, you
They're
know.
being very well behaved.
Yeah, I'm saving you from that.
Thank you, Roger.
Just to comment on your last comment, the problem with Verify. We've seen it with every application since the first email system came into operation. There has to be a user need or a user demand, and at the moment there isn't. Why, for instance, aren't Barclays saying you can access our system using Verify? Why doesn't Tesco do it? Why doesn't the train companies do it? I think it's down to the government to persuade these companies to do it. But how they're going to do it, I haven't got a clue.
Well, let me suggest this, that with all the power in the United States government, they've had a really tough time persuading US commercial firms to do it a better way. So I think we have to find a framework where the self-interest of commercial providers aligns with the public interest as exemplified by Verify. We have to kind of bring those two together. So I'm not laying all this on Verify, but I'm saying that Verify is an important catalyst for this kind of conversation to occur here in the UK. So is it government's job? We could debate that all night.
Do you know that Janet from Verify and Barrett from Barclays are still here, so we can effectively debate this all night. But we do need to usher ourselves to a close.
It's not that problem. It's convincing not the banks even or the commercial companies. It's convincing the end user that there's a real benefit for them to do this that way, that they can access all their bank accounts just using one ID or one way of doing it. If you've got 3 or 4 bank accounts, how do you remember? Well, you do, but I mean, you've got different dongles and things for each one. So it's the end user that has to be convinced.
I'd rather talk about my dongle later, but I think, all kidding aside, thank you, Janet. Just wanted to see if you were there.
Don, is there a compelling point you'd like to bring the
Yes, I'd like to
bring to a close,
like to make
and then I'll do closing remarks.
I'd like to, forgive me for that.
Just a last point from Don, and then we'll need to bring this to a close. Thank you.
If you buy into this notion this hypothesis that I've laid on you, and it's just one person's opinion, that it's in the economic interests of the commercial firms in this room, as well as the interest of the government agencies in this room, to work together on a private sector-led public-private partnership that will speak to the issues that Roger rightly points out, and to the others that you have but haven't asked. But I think that this is it's an inflection point. And to the extent that OIX can be the neutral convener of a conversation that will take place with accents different than mine, I think 2016 will see OIX UK, OIX Europe emerge. And it's my hope that it can make a positive contribution to the topics and challenges that we've talked about today.